Throughout the Second World War, there were many experimental weapons and aircraft that the Germans thought would change the course of the conflict. The Nazis believed that the Wonder Weapon program would define their legacy and would also turn the tide in the war in their favour, following their fortunes at the Battle of Stalingrad. This program saw V-1 rockets and V-2 rockets flown over the English Channel towards Britain, but there was one rocket-powered fighter plane that was incredibly dangerous, not just for those in Allied aircraft fighting it, but for the pilot, as it was known that the Messerschmitt Me163 Komet could melt a pilot. But what is the story behind this terrifying aircraft? The Messerschmitt Me163 Komet was credited with only 16 victories during the Second World War, and they targeted bombing planes. They were immensely expensive, and they set an unofficial speed record in October 1941. To the casual observer, the aircraft looks like an overweight Sparrow, and it's very small compared to other German planes. 10 of the Comets were first built as a prototype, and they were then tested by Luftwaffe pilots. But during this initial part of the testing, it was found that the undercarriage of the Comet's large springs would rebound and could also strike the plane. When it came to land, it had to be collected by a tractor that connected to the front of the aircraft, as it couldn't manoeuvre very well on the ground. In the air, the Comet was also unstable, and when it approached max speed, this was when any slight movement of the controls could send it hurtling towards the ground. It could spend a total of just 8 minutes in the air, and then had to be refueled. It could be thrown around by the pilots like something that had never been seen before, but because of its immense speed and its climbing abilities, even pilots had to go on special diets, eating only small amounts of fibre, as there was a fear that the gas in the pilot's intestines and the extreme G-force could cause severe stomach problems. Of course, many of the pilots also got very sick. But because it was small and light, when it came into land, especially not on an airfield, it tended to flip over, and some of the test pilots had bad facial fractures, and some even suffered broken backs when the aircraft dived towards the ground. But that wasn't the worst of it. The fuel used by the Comet was terribly corrosive, and it could also explode as it was volatile. If the fuel touched the skin of a pilot, it could dissolve it. The pilots were sat close to the fuel tanks too, meaning that if there was a leak in the fuel tank, then a pilot would be burned terribly, and because of this, the Comet has developed a reputation for being an aircraft that could in fact dissolve its pilots. The motor used two substances. The first, T-Stoff, was made up of 90% hydrogen peroxide, and the other, C-Stoff, was a mix of methanol, calcium permanganate, hydrazine and water. When mixed together, they became very volatile and could explode, and this then pushed the plane forward, and it would travel very quickly. Pilots began to believe that if something went wrong with the Comet, then they hoped that their deaths would be very quick, and they hoped they'd be killed rather than injured. One pilot who had a terrible death in one was Josef Pöhs. He was a recipient of the Knight's Cross and was a part of Jägergeschwader 54's fighter wing. He was also a test pilot, but on the 30th of December 1943, he made a final flight in his Comet. His plane was ready to fly, and on the runway, the drop-away undercarriage bounced on the ground, and it struck the fuel line. This led to complete engine failure, and Pöhs tried to glide the Comet to the ground. His plane crashed into the town of Bad Wischenahn, and truth be told, there was little left of him. The fuel had caused him to melt in his seat. One man who discovered the site said, when they finally reached him and turned the Comet over, they were greeted with a gruesome sight. T-Stoff leaking from the ruptured line had dissolved the unconscious Pöhs alive. Another eyewitness claimed that the pilot's right arm, had dissolved to nothing. The other arm as well as his head were little more than soft jelly. This was one of Germany's most decorated and skilled Luftwaffe pilots, who at the hands of the brutal and deadly aircraft had been dissolved. There were accounts during the war when the Comet was involved in actions against the Allies. In July 1944, the plane tried to shoot down a few American bombers over Mersburg, but was chased off by P-38 Lightnings. In October 1944, one was shot down by Mustangs, and the pilot somehow managed to survive by parachuting out. There are today a number of these experimental planes which exist in the world. They are strikingly very small, and they look very tiny compared to some of the war's bigger bombers. But the Comet was deadly in its own right. but mostly for pilots, but not for the enemy. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe and share as it really does help the channel, and thanks again for watching.